That's right. Just got to move the Texans to the NFC instead of the AFC. I changed the vision. I want to play Patrick Mahomes into the Super Bowl.
You were saying they were in such an easy division with the Colts.
They were
like,
we can wipe the floor with the Colts, the Titans, the Jaguars, and everyone else that's good.
maybe that's the way Detroit felt after going running the table through the season until the playoffs.
Well, Detroit and the Vikings had that coming. Season hype. How are y'all doing this evening?
Good.
Boy, it's a different perspective. Up, right. You guys could get a little closer. Just push up right here. I don't know. I don't get to see all the PTAC members in person this often, so it's great. Usually it's like a lot of remote feeds.
Not itchy.
They look really good.
Oh, all right.
Oh, man.
It grows back.
I thought we had a competition going here. Let's see who could look the oldest, fastest. Oh. Good question.
Hi, Sarah.
Sure.
Anthony? Good. Good evening. Welcome to the study session for the Ellensburg City Council, 21st of January, 2025. And why don't we begin by just introducing ourselves for the audience. So you can see their names. Go ahead.
Sarah Boshaw.
Nancy Goodlow. I'm Nancy Lilquist.
David Miller.
Good evening, Delano Palmer.
Yes.
Jim Herson.
Ann Minor.
Deidre Blanchard. Amy Spitznos. Betsy Dunbar.
Awesome. The way you introduced yourself, you should have said I'm Johnny Cash. Just had that.
Oh,
Okay. Anyway.
well, I love Johnny Cash, so thank you.
Anyway, we're going to have a conversation regarding the Transit Benefit District and potential upcoming election. Did you want to start the process?
I do. And so good evening, council and members of our Public Transit Advisory Board. I think this is the first joint study session or meeting we've had in probably a really long time. So I want to thank everybody for setting up some special time to talk together. These are kind of unusual circumstances. This is not how we planned to have this discussion as we looked ahead about a year ago. And this was a little bit of a surprise when it came to budget time. And so I want to lay out for everyone just how we got to where we are today. So the format of tonight, we have about 36 slides, and I apologize, that's a lot, but I kind of want to make sure people have something to look at and bring people along on why we're here. A little bit about just the budget process and how we got here. Our transit system in general, Betsy's going to talk a little bit about that. Transportation, and then the Transportation Benefit District, TBD. We're going to use that acronym a little bit tonight. Some of the considerations in a discussion. So I'm going to kick us off. And I would just remind folks, if you have questions, feel free to let me know. I tried to be pretty comprehensive in what we're going to cover tonight, and I'll try to kind of move through the slides pretty quickly so we can get to the discussion as well. So if you do have questions, please remember that we have folks who listen online, so please use your mics. That'll help folks in the room and people online. So All right, so I'm going to start out tonight again by talking about the Transportation Benefit District and where we are with this discussion tonight. So currently in the city code, we have it codified that we collect 0.2% to fund the Transportation Benefit District. Cities can only authorize tax collections that the state gives us the authority to do. This Transportation Benefit District is traditionally used for funding transportation system improvements like street maintenance programs, things like that. I believe we are the only ones in the state who use this primarily to fund a transit program. And so, but this is a 10-year tax. It was voted in 2016. We know that it's slated to expire September 30th of 2026. So it was on our radar to look at renewing this. It's been a very valuable program, and Betsy will talk about that as well as I will moving forward. And just a reminder that when we got to the end of our budget, this was a really difficult budget year, probably the most difficult one I've ever been involved in. Traditionally, we'll see increases in our expenditures on a 2 to 3% per year. Inflation really took a bite out of the local jurisdictions' budgets, including ours. And so this structural deficit, and I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that, it really caught up to us. And so when we saw inflation of 5 to 10% per year over a number of years, that really takes a bite out of the dollars that we have set aside for expenditures. And we have limits on the increases in the revenues that we get. So we saw pretty flat revenues and pretty steep expenditures. That's not sustainable. And so in our budget process to balance the budget through 2025 and 2026, we made some very strategic choices. And one of those was to try to bring this forward and create some flexibility in the use of these transportation benefit dollars as we move forward, among a number of other adaptations in the budget. So just a reminder, council sets a strategic vision looking at what is the community, what are the needs of the community moving forward. We knew this was on our radar to renew the transit funding. And the other thing that we're wanting to look at is, can we find more sustainable funding for infrastructure maintenance programs, especially those based on our community needs. So I want to talk about how this is a little bit of budget basics, and I apologize for the slides that folks have seen before through the budget process. This is just a general overview of how our city budget is structured. We have our general fund, and those are the general fund services that really are primarily tax supported. So it's not something that we collect money for. Our streets and our transit are not something that people pay for. It's paid for by the community, essentially by the taxpayers. And I'll go through a list of what those general funds options are. We have special revenue funds as well, and they help fund some of those, again, governmental functions. And those have special kind of restricted uses in our city budget. We have also capital projects, and then our proprietary funds. Those are any of our utilities, like our water system has to operate like its own business. And so if you use water, you're actually paying a fee for that water that you use that helps support the water system. So those general government services are those general services that your parks and your libraries, your streets, and a number of other functions. All right. So when we're looking at streets and how we fund our streets, and I'll go to another overview of the budget, we have about 5 different funds. And overall, the city budget, and I'm looking back at Keith, we have somewhere between 45 and 56 funds, different funds, and we call them different things. And they all have different rules about what money goes in and what money can come out. The couple funds we're going to look at today are street and arterial street funds. Our street fund funds maintenance and operations, our street preservation programs. Our arterial street fund funds our capital projects. And sometimes when we're doing a project, we're going to improve the bus stops, the curbs and gutters, the sidewalk, and also the street itself. And we might do some other utility work. So there are a whole bunch of different dollars that go into support those projects. And we work very hard. Our staff do a really great job of leveraging the local dollars that we bring in to actually bring in grant funds to try to capitalize on that as much as possible. The sidewalk fund is something that we fund with the 1/4% for real estate excise tax. That money goes in, and we have a program that goes to restore sidewalks, refurbish sidewalks, infill programs. And so sidewalks are very expensive. And so that's the fund. If we're making sidewalk improvements, we use that. Transportation impact fees are when development happens. The philosophy is development pays for development. Money goes into an account based on the impact to the transportation of the system. So if it's a house, we assume that there will be one car trip in over and back. And so that's one car trip. If it's a business, it might be 50 car trips during peak hours. The money that goes into that fund actually is targeted to create, to fund capital projects that create capacity in our system. One of those projects, if you look at Mountain View and Bull Road, we're preparing for a capacity project that no specific development will pay for that, but a number of developments that have happened across the city that will impact that intersection pay for that. So lots of structure goes into how we fund projects, our transportation system. It's a very expensive system to run. And then finally, our transit fund. This fund is primarily supported by that sales tax, that 0.2% that was authorized by the voters in 2016 to fund our transit services. We also have the ability to fund transit-related capital expenditures, and we'll show you some of those things. Over the years, we've been really careful and really cautious not to overuse that fund and really try to make sure everything in transit is fundable. So we have been very, very cautious about making capital or project expenditures out of that transit fund. So again, when we look at the structure of, this is our general fund, sort of the revenues that go in, our special revenue funds, those restricted funds, here's where our public transit fund lies. All right, and we can come back to any of these if you want. When we talk about governmental fund activities, when I talk about general government services, these are those services that really provide. So there's a lot of competition. There's no shortage of needs. People can always come up with ideas about how the services that we should provide and increase and how we should spend our money. And it's always a difficult sorting and prioritizing process as we do our budget to figure out how to balance those needs and interests. And that's a difficult process for the council. All right. So as we look at our fund, those general fund, those governmental fund services, we have a limited amount of opportunity to provide the revenues to deliver those services. If you see that the primary support is tax funding for those general governmental services, this charges for services is actually charges that they're primarily interfund charges. And so when the finance department does something for another part of the city, they can actually charge dollars. So it helps to support that finance function. So that's oftentimes intergovernmental charges. Our intergovernmental revenue is primarily grants to fund those general government services. Fines and penalties are generally late fees, and miscellaneous, we had some pretty decent interest rates. And so we were actually able to bring in some interest rates, and that's where that miscellaneous comes in. So again, primarily tax supported. And if we look at the breakdown of the taxes that go into supporting that general government, about half of those are sales tax. And so, so again, sales tax is fairly elastic. During the pandemic, people continued to spend money. Our sales tax were actually fairly healthy and remained that way. We were expecting them to take a big dip. The recovery dollars and the money that was out in the community, people continued to spend. We are seeing a flattening of that. And as we looked into this next budget season, we have to project 2 years ahead. And so we're projecting fairly flat, and we'll continue to adjust those as we move forward. And then remember that property tax that we have in Washington State, 1% plus new construction limit on how much we can raise property tax. And so even if our expenses go up by 10% in a year or 5% in the year, that property tax wedge can only go up by 1% in that year. And then our utilities, when people pay their utility bill, there's a tax on those, and that goes to help general government services. And it's pretty common if we look at other cities across Washington state. About 20 we're kind of right in the average about the amount of utility tax or B&O taxes that go to support our general fund. So it's not high and it's really not that low. All right. So when we look at sales tax, a lot of folks think, well, the city gets so much money. And so when you pay right now, and January 21st, our city rate is 8.6%. The breakdown of sales tax is that the state essentially gets 6.5%. And so 6.5 pennies for every dollar that is spent in the community goes back to the state. There are some dollars that come back in sales tax in rural sales tax credits. We call those 0.09 funds. The county actually administers those. Those aren't on this list. But the city gets essentially 1 cent for just the general government services. And the rest of these, sometimes we call this a la carte government. Communities have to go back because of the limits on the property tax, the 1%, and the elasticity in the sales tax. Oftentimes communities have to say, we want to fund this. And so go back to the voters and ask for the authority to fund a very specific type of service given a specific revenue. And that's why we have all of those special revenue funds in our city budget. So we have the public safety sales tax that has a very specific use. It's for those added capacity for a criminal justice system, and that's administered through the county. Our 0.2%, this is our transportation benefit district, goes to fund transit. And again, we have our affordable housing that was also passed by the voters. And then this is a combined, the behavioral health, the juvenile detention, and criminal justice. And then new this year is a 0.2% for our 911 communication system. So that's the general breakdown of the sales tax. And then property tax, just a reminder, sorry, this is hidden over here, that property tax for every dollar, the city gets about 14% of that. The primary funding for your property tax dollars go to the state for schools in general. All right. Okay, so when we bring in sales tax, we actually have to distribute that and help fund all of those services that you saw up above, our libraries and our parks and our streets. And so what happens is over time to fund our streets, our staff have been able to leverage dollars to fund a lot of street repairs and a lot of capital improvement projects. But over time, what happens is with our arterial street, more and more money, we're moving more and more of our sales tax dollars, which has a limit to it, sales tax dollars over to support streets. And so the red here is from 2004 to 2024. And remember, we passed the transportation benefit district here in 2016. So those numbers would kick in there. The arterial street fund is our capital, and then our street support and operations. And this is our chip seal program and other maintenance programs for our transportation system. And so more and more, again, we're seeing a rise in how much money is transferred over from sales tax to fund the street services. When we balanced the budget this year, one of the changes that we made is we did a 1-year reduction in our street maintenance, and that's our street preservation program, so chip seal, and I'll talk a little bit about the value of that. Typically, when we transfer dollars over, the biggest amount stays in the general fund. The second largest amount has traditionally been streets, and so the red is 2024. And then we have some debt service, and then we have a commitment by policy to fund arts in our community, and that's been fairly flat. And so, for 2025 and 26, instead of passing the traditional amount over for streets, we actually lowered that amount. We're going to do about half of our street maintenance program this year. Well, we hopefully will be able to expand that with some shared access to the transportation benefit dollars to help fund some of our streets in the future. So I'm going to stop talking, and Betsy is going to take over, and I could just do the clicker from here if you want, Betsy. Okay.
Well, good evening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history and the future of transit in Ellensburg. In 2011, the city, ASCWU, Hope Source, and WashDOT collaborated to fund, operate a public transit service in the city of Ellensburg. In 2013, the first transit development plan was completed. 2015, the Ellensburg Transit Benefit District was created. In 2016, council authorized the Transit Benefit District, special election for sales and use tax, and it passed with a 63% voter approval. In 2017, the city assumed operation of Central Transit. In 2019, service expanded from 2 routes to 5 routes and added ADA paratransit and cabulance services. 2021 to 24, Central Transit got more amenities, updated logo, bus wraps, a technology platform, and rider apps. Next. 2025, so talking about maybe the future, 2025, a special election will happen to renew the Transportation Benefit District funding of 0.2% sales and use tax and expanded use for transportation system maintenance. 2026, the original 2016 Transit Benefit District funded 0.2% sales and use tax will sunset next. So our goals mirror the regional and state transportation goals. And a lot of that includes safety, ADA compliance, transit amenities, connections to other transportation services, safe streets, and service connections to biking and pedestrian trails. Zero emissions, buses, and infrastructure is also on the list, and much more next. So over the past years, we have completed many ADA projects, capital projects, and this picture demonstrates the importance of having ADA compliant bus stops. Next. In 2025, we'll have over 27 capital projects planned at our bus stops. These capital projects will result in all 82 of our bus stops being ADA compliant, which is great. Next. In 2026 to 2029, listed are some of our future goals. We want to obviously meet increased operating costs, route expansions, 30-minute route times, infrastructure for zero-emission vehicles, increased safety measures, bus stop amenities, and a transit station or hub. Next. So there are many reasons why public transit is so important. It reduces traffic congestion, results in more parking, increases economic growth in our community, and increases cleaner air. But we know the real why in transit lies in the lives of our passengers who depend on our services for independence and freedom to access medical care, recreation, education, social services, employment, shopping, and so much more. Thank you.
Thank you, Betsy. My pictures are nearly as pretty as hers are. So, all right. We're going to talk a little bit about the transit funding history. And so this is just the revenues and expenditures for our transit fund, essentially. That's that Transportation Benefit District dollars, including grant dollars. And I have those separated out. And so over time, our revenues have grown fairly steadily over the last 10 years. And our expenditures have also grown with that. All right. We've been able to secure some grant funding. It's been a priority to reduce emissions. Transit systems, and especially rural transit systems, have been very well funded by state and federal dollars over the last few years as communities and states have emissions goals, vehicle miles traveled. Oftentimes getting people out of their single-use cars and trips is a way to incentivize that. And so we're seeing seeing and have had the ability to secure some pretty steady grants for operations of our system and also for capital projects. Again, we do have a contract with Hope Source to operate our transit system. They actually own the buses. And so they also have been very successful in getting grants to fund the purchase of those vehicles over time. So our transit grants here, you can see the dollars in red, and then our arterial streets grants. We've also, as we look at funding our transportation system, that we've been able to get some really good dollars into our community, leverage those as well. All right. And then as we look at the use of our transit dollars, and I'm just going to transportation benefit district dollars. And so these are in that 0.2%. We've been really cautious over the years, being very specific about if there are transit related enhancements, that's when we'll make investments. And Betsy showed you a few photos of ADA ramps. And so the city has an ADA transition plan. Not all of our street access is ADA compliant. And so as a city, we have to have a plan to get us there. And our transit routes have afforded some priorities when we're doing projects to improve, do curbs and ADA sidewalk ramps, bus stop enhancements as well that are ADA compliant. And so this is history, just looking back from 2013, really over the last 10 years. And so this next year, we have a big project along Water Street. There are, I believe it's 120 ADA ramps that transit is slated to fund. That's all along the bus route. And so that's a huge project, and we were able to leverage some state funding for that project as well. So again, the transit fund has been instrumental in helping us leverage some of those dollars for improvements all across our community related to transit. So our transit fund balance, this is something that we've been keeping our eyes on for a while. And again, this was part of a long discussion about how can we make sure and we're maximizing. And there were discussions early on this last year about, what we're gaining fund balance because we've been so successful getting grants and operating our system efficiently, and making sure we're thinking about the long-term needs of our transit system and transportation system as well. But and I said at the beginning, in an ideal world, this is not the way we would have gone about this. We ended up with a budget shortfall and the idea to move forward to try to find an adaptive way to maximize the use of our transit and transportation system funding. And so this was one of those opportunities to look at how we might better use this restricted funding to be a little more flexible for the rest of our transportation system improvements. So I'm going to talk briefly about the street system. This is a growing community, and every time we do an annexation, we take in more roads. Every time we do a subdivision, eventually we take on more streets. And so our miles of streets over time have increased pretty significantly, as have our sidewalk miles, our bike lane miles. And we've also made enhancements again in our transit system and amenities with our bus shelter and bus stops as well. So our programs, Betsy mentioned the Transit Development Plan and Zero Emissions Plan. We also have our Transportation Improvement, our 6-year program, our ADA Transition Plan, sidewalk plans. We have many, many plans that we're always looking for opportunities to fund and prioritize the needs to make sure we're providing the infrastructure necessary for our community. And like transit, streets maybe aren't as sassy or as transit buses and with the people, but we do know that streets and all of our complete streets, our buses, our transit pullouts, they're all part of a multimodal community that we create connectivity and accessibility and really quality of life. And so if you want people to complain, leave the potholes and we'll get folks showing up and complaining. So making sure that we're maintaining the things that we have and trying to do that to the best of our our ability within our means is incredibly important. So when we're looking at transportation and system improvements, I think one of the things to talk a little bit about is we have a street preservation program. And this last year, our chip seal, people don't necessarily like the chip seal program because it's messy and it's dusty and it's oily and we have rock chips for a few weeks. But what happens is we are actually investing in protecting our infrastructure. It costs a lot less to maintain our streets and chip seal them and keep and seal them and then it does to do an overlay or to do a reconstruction of a street. And so a chip seal are minor improvements that we can do. And again, here we see an overlay and then the reconstruction. They are very, very expensive. Here's a graph that shows kind of by the square foot, a chip seal versus a grind and overlay when you start adding curbs and ramps and reconstructing a street and then all of the other amenities. It gets very expensive very quickly. So the more we can maintain our streets through things like chip seal programs, the more effective we're protecting our infrastructure for the long term. So our transportation system, our engineers have gone, taken pencil to paper and said, what is it that we need to maintain our transportation system? We're looking at about a program that they said this would help cycle in some of our overlay programs and also our pavement improvement programs, our street protection programs. About just under $2 million a year is what they estimate would be a reasonable budget for maintaining our streets. All right. And this isn't very easy to read. It really is when we do our arterial street program, when we do our transportation improvement report to council. Typically, it's late in the year. We look at the amount of grants, oftentimes between 2 times and 5 times the amount of local funds we've been able to leverage for projects outside our community. So again, one of the questions on applications for our grant funding is, do you have a transportation benefit district? Our funders want to know that we have local dollars that are being contributed to our transportation system in order for them to give us. And so we've been able to answer yes, but again, we've been very restrictive on how we've used that for the rest of our transportation system over the last 9 years. So about transportation benefit districts. So again, by state law, the state authorizes cities to use transportation benefit districts. Council can create a transportation benefit district, as Betsy mentioned. You did that in 2015, but the voters have to fund it. Anything beyond 0.1%. The rules have changed over the last 10 years. And so the first 0.1% can actually be councilmanic. And anything beyond that has to be approved by the voters. And it's only for a period of 10 years. And so as we mentioned, we know that our current transportation benefit district is going to sunset September 30th of 2026. And so we would need to revote that in order to have that continue beyond that date. Again, it is authorized to spend up to, ask the voters for up to 0.3% to fund transportation benefit district activities. When we looked at the budget, our estimations, what we did is we looked at maintaining that 0.2% and just renewing that 0.2% and providing the ability, which is already provided in our city code, which I'll show you next, to use a little more of that have more flexibility in using more of that for transportation maintenance projects. For instance, chip seal, those street preservation programs. So there is an option under the law too for license fees up to $50 for tabs. And so if somebody were to go renew their tab in the city, the council could pass a $50 fee that would only be for city residents. And if it were any more than that, the law allows up to a $100 tab fee to be added. Some communities have the sales tax and tab fees. We're not recommending that, but that is a tool in your toolbox to do so. So, and again, as we balance the budget, we looked at renewing only that 0.2%, not adding more, not changing that, and so doing that sometime in 2025. And again, our city code has two things that were passed by ordinance. One is the definition of a transportation benefit district. And at the very beginning, you saw our sales tax authority in a different chapter that authorized a 0.2% that expires next year. And then also the Public Transit Advisory Committee, and it talks about the makeup and the responsibility for that committee. So just about done here. As we look at 2025, if we were going to renew this to the voters, we really have three options left this year. There is an April election. It's a special election. It's due February 21st. The ballot measure would need to be filed by the 21st. So that's coming up very quickly. August 5th is a primary, and the filing date for that is May 2nd. And then November 4th, which is a general election, has an August deadline for that as well. And typically, when you run, you want at least a year to 2 years. Again, this is not ideal conditions as we're proposing here, but we are proposing a renewal of a current, not an increase of a current funding measure. So as you look to the questions, and I appreciate a number of folks that have talked about what their concerns are, and so these are things to talk through. We live in a time of uncertainty. We're not going to know all the answers for what's going to happen in the future. And so we have federal and state, we've been really successful at getting public transit grants. We don't know if those will continue. That is an uncertainty. And that's for our consolidated grant program through RSDOT and others. Our political environment may change. There may be different priorities as we talk about funding options. The timing, again, we only have 3 different elections if this were to go to a ballot measure. And it does take a little time to do some public information and make sure we have the information out for folks to make an educated decision. And then we know that there is a timing that there's an expiration date looming in the next year unless this is renewed. And the amount is also an option. Again, currently our rate is 0.2%. And our recommendation is to go 0.2. You could go something less, you could go something more, or something different. And again, defining that the ballot measure expands. In our city code, you'll notice it doesn't say this has to be used just for our transit system. This is very consistent with state code. What happened is in the ballot measure that was put before the voters, there was some specific language. The whereases were about funding our public transit system. And so our recommendation, if you were to approve, would be to move forward with a little bit broader language for that. And again, you do have the ability to phase if you wanted to do a renewal. And if there was need or interest down the road, there's an opportunity to go back to the voters and ask for an additional 0.1% or some other mechanism to fund street maintenance. So I did put in, actually, I'll talk about this and then I'll I'll go to your handouts real quick. So, the question is, what if it fails? And so what are the options if the 0.2 fails? And so the revenue for transportation benefit district, 0.1% right now brings in about $800,000 a year. And so the 0.2 brings in about 1.7 million per year. The councilmanic option, there is always that option, and that would have to be the first 0.1% of sales and use tax. And again, that's just by a vote of the council. That's what councilmanic means. And then, or the license fee of $50 is another potential funding revenue. And then service reductions, we balance the budget based on 2026. And so, and that means we had reduced our service, our street preservation services in 2025 as we sort of look at the future. Our sales tax may come in a little higher, so we may not have to cut significantly, but we would have to revisit our budget for 2026 and make some adjustments. And then, there is always, if we look at our general property tax levy, there's always going back to the voters for that option too. Oftentimes people don't like property tax changes as sales tax changes are easier because anybody traveling through and purchasing things in our community actually helps pay into that. And again, folks who travel through here are using our streets as well. So, and then fund balance, we do have some fund balance in transit. And so some of the discussion is if we needed to regroup, if there was a need, we could fund our transit system for a period of time, probably a couple of years, and to make sure we can continue that service. So one side element, and this is a bigger discussion, but I think it deserves a little attention here, and that is, so the authority or the purview of the Public Transit Advisory Committee. If we were to expand this, one of the things we've been looking at with our boards and commissions is how can we better help represent some of the city services and make sure our advisory boards have meaningful work, and also that our staff have real clear ideas about which advisory board is responsible for which function. We've struggled with the Environmental Commission and sort of redefining what their role was. And this discussion actually added an opportunity to say, what if we, because right now, no one is looking at our complete streets or transportation system. We don't have an advisory board or committee. And so this would make sense to sort of add that purview into the PTAC committee's purview as we look at expanding the Environmental Commission to more water resources and some of the sustainability and energy plan purview, and then clarifying the Utility Advisory Committee as we split out our energy services again. So it's a different discussion, but just wanted to drop that as we're thinking about having an advisory committee sort of oversee the investments. It makes sense to add that to the purview of PTAC as well. So that's sort of a new idea and just recent. So I have talked way too much. I would be available for questions and or discussion if you want me to go back to anything. So Mayor?
So I'm a little bit flexible with this, but I think what I'd like to do is sort of allow PTAC to sort of give us their feedback. If we have questions about this specific issue, I think those are important. I'd like to stay away from council sort of weighing in on what our opinions are right now. It's a study session. We're not making a decision. We will obviously have lots of conversation about this and have an opportunity to make decisions, but we got 20 minutes and we invited you here. So we're going to let you guys go first.
Guess I'll go first. Jim Herson, member of the PTAC.
Do you want to grab the mic?
Closer to the mic,
Yeah.
please.
Most of you know who I am, but I don't know that all of you do. So my background is I worked in county government most of my professional life. Most of that time was either as the county civic deputy or as an elected official. So I've been involved in the mosh pit of trying to figure out financial priorities and how you're going to spend that. And I understand that's a really tough job. I don't want to have that as my job. But one thing I did notice, and this is not intended as an insult, somebody said similar things before, is when you're looking for money, everybody is looking for, well, where's there a pot of money? And then, oh, there's some money. Let's grab that and use it for this. There's always a good reason for those things. And it's not as a disparaging comment, it's just that's how budgets work. You look where there's some funding and what can we do with this? And part of it was, a big thing here was, I think, we weren't spending all the money that was available for the transit system, which frankly, I think that's something that people don't understand government does. We don't just spend money just because we have it. I think people think the government does that, but I'm being somebody on the inside, that's not true. We often, you don't spend it just because you have it. It would be easy for us to just spend it all. We could have just thrown out some more bus routes or change hours or just spend more money, but that wasn't the choice. I've been on the PTAC for a couple of years now, and frankly, what we've been focusing on is it's a relatively new system. COVID kind of put things behind, and our focus has been, we want to make this an efficient bus system. We want it to be a reliable bus system. I think we're heading there in the right direction. Before, we used to have buses were coming too early and it wasn't reliable and people weren't there, but we're getting our timing down in that and make things accessible. Because I think our vision is We want to have a good, efficient system that's operating well, and then we grow from there. Because I see our current system as a beginning, not the system, it's the beginning. We got lots of areas here that aren't served. Lots of parts of the community. And I think the taxpayers, hopefully, that's what they want us to do, is don't just spend the money because you have it. Figure out how to do government services correctly, do them efficiently, and then you expand once you've learned how to operate properly. We've been talking about expansion. We've also been talking about we're not using all the money, but we're good with that. We see like Radio Hill doesn't have service, Craig's Hill doesn't have service, the Capitol Street corridor doesn't have service. There's parts in the northwest part of town that don't have it, the southeast part of town, north of Bender, up by the airport, there's not service there. I'd like to see service be expanded there. Frankly, I'm retired now, my wife's retired. If I had bus service in my neighborhood, we'd get rid of a car because I don't need a second car. That's how buses aren't just for people who can't afford things. It's efficiency. If I'm gonna go downtown, if I don't take a car, that's one more parking space for someone else to use when they drive down there. That's part of it. So we want to get our frequency up. So I guess my concern, because we haven't as a committee, had a vote on what our position is. So this is mine, is what the policy choices of the council. Because for instance, if it's a 0.2 and if you're going to say, okay, half goes to transit, half goes to roads, what your policy choice then is, you don't want the transit system to improve or expand. We just wouldn't have the funding to do it. If we're just, if that's where it is. If what we're really talking about is we're going to have a sales tax to fund transit, but if there happens to be extra money that can be used for other transportation issues, that makes perfect sense to me. But I don't want transit to sort of take a second, backseat to it all, because I think it's a really important thing. Another thing I want you to know about is our rate. We're talking about a 0.2 sales tax. I know it's kind of a interesting statute we're using to use it. I looked this up on the MRSC website. There are 32 transit agencies in this state. 31 of them use sales tax as their primary source of revenue, and no one has a lower sales tax rate than us. There's us and 3 other places have a 0.2%. Most of the agencies have a 0.6% or higher. So 0.2% for transit is not like, oh my gosh, there's all this money there. And we're small enough and trying to be efficient enough to where we're not spending it. So if you pull too much back, we just can't get done what I would hope we would be able to do. I also have some politics concerns, but one thing I would point out is one of the reasons why we didn't spend so much money is because Betsy's been doing a really good job of getting the funding for us. If we lost the state and federal funding, I don't think we'd be having a surplus. And with our current politics, what the news was, what the state's 10 to 20 billion, that's at the B short for the next biennium. I think on a federal level, it's really clear that they're looking to try to cut trillions of dollars from budget. I'm not optimistic that that will filter down to a whole lot of transit funding for a small town in Eastern Washington. So that's a real concern. If the transit money, we don't get our grants, and then transit money is getting shifted to other purposes, we have a problem. Other thing I would be concerned about is if we're doing this, a vote that is like for roads, for chip seal, and which chip seals are really important. I was just public works attorney, and chip seals are the best cost-effective way of maintaining roads you can hope for, because they cost so little compared to the other ways. But voters aren't going to get excited about a sales tax for plowing roads and doing chip seal programs. I think the county levy they just had, lost 70% voted against a road levy. I know it's a different voter base, but still cautionary tale. I think, however, that the citizens in Ellensburg are good-hearted people and a lot of help people who need help, and that a transit system will get a lot of support. I think that's what happened last time. So my view is, I get where we've got some extra money and we should have some more flexibility. Understand that, it makes sense. Maybe tweak the language so that more could be used there, but don't. My hope is that you don't put transit as sort of the secondary, or we'll just split it sort of a thing. Because I think it is a good service for people. I don't know how many of you have ridden the bus. My guess is most of you haven't. I ride it a lot. I don't have to. I just ride it to see how it goes, to see the people that use it, to see what people use it for. And there's a lot of people that rely upon it. You know, you get moms with their kids in the stroller, they're just taking the kid for a ride because the kids need to get out of the town. You know, you've got people getting down to the store, going to their medical appointments, getting picked up at the, you know, retirement home to get where they're going. So really a valuable service. And I just hate to see that go away. And I'd like to see it expand. So that's what I would like you to think about as far as because budgets are policy documents. We all know that. And if the policy is this is a transit tax, but if there happens to be any extra money, go ahead, Public Works, to use it for some other good purposes. Because if this thing grows the way it is, it may be at the end of the next 10-year cycle, we're using all of the 2/10, and we'd still have the lowest tax rate in the state. So anyway, I'd just like you to think about that as how you're going forward.
Anything else?
Any questions? Any thoughts?
I'm pretty much, it's pretty much the same thing for me. I work with a lot of people that ride transit and they've expressed that they need more routes, more growth in different areas. So that's my biggest concern, is it not being able to grow further. I also like the idea of possibly, like, after a certain amount of time or a quarter, if there's a certain amount of money left, maybe percentage of going to this, but it does make me nervous, the idea of just cutting it and taking it. And then the people in the community that need it, we just can't grow for them. So yeah, that's it.
I guess I would say, I mean, there's already a few areas that are only getting service once an hour, and we would really like to see it at least every half hour. You know, we would like to see it get better. That's our hope. And, you know, another thing I think is, I think a lot of people could use transit if we had enough service that they could have one car, kind of like what Jim was saying. I mean, that helps families, especially people are kind of trying to cut back right now. To be able to have that option, I think would be really helpful.
Council.
Thank you all for all the great comments and the feedback and the presentation. For me, a couple of things that is going to be helpful for me for future decisions as far as what makes the most sense. I wrote down a couple of notes on things that I would like to see to help make this informed decision. First, I'd like to see if you have information or some numbers on ridership over the last 5 years. I'd also like to see the ebbs and flows throughout the year, kind of see what's the peak season and ridership, that kind of stuff. If you have a city mapping of showing where the most ridership is occurring around the city would also be helpful. This will kind of help me to understand, okay, you're asking for more routes per hour because here's the need. This is the population of servicing. Or if it's on the outside skirts of town, what need is there? Obviously, if we start talking about county, then the conversation is there a conversation with county as far as if they're going to pitch in a cost for that? And that's way bigger than this conversation, but just a dialogue. If you're talking about needs, there might be some rural needs that might be, that will need to discuss, but mostly focusing in the city. Also, let's see. Jim, you mentioned us having the lowest percentage in the state. I'd like to see those other cities, the size of those cities and their ridership as comparison.
It's actually counties. It's Grant County and Stoughton County and Lewis County.
Okay.
The ones that are 0.2%.
Okay.
And then I don't know what the ridership numbers are. I was just trying to figure out funding sources and
Sure. This
uses a utility.
I get it. This is just me trying to understand comparative cities of our size to see what their funding is for those types of cities and their riderships, and just kind of make sure that we're scaling at the right level. So if another city is, say, 10, 15% larger than ours, then it's reasonable to say that we'll be that much larger in X amount of years. So based upon their ridership, it may make sense to increase cost or revenue associated with it. So if we could find some of those information, that would be helpful for making an informed decision. So
Yes, we can definitely get you all of that information. We gather that each month. I will state that 2024, we had the highest ridership in the history of Central Transit. So we know that it's growing and we know people are riding it and need it.
We like to think it's because we've become much more reliable. When I first was riding it, I think we had a bunch of drivers that were used to doing like dial-a-ride, where you have like a 15-minute window, you have to be available. They didn't quite catch on that with a bus, you never leave a stop early, ever. It is like the worst thing possible of a bus driver is you want to be on time, but you never leave early, because people, if it's going to leave at 23 after, you do not leave before then. So people know it's reliable. And that's been our big focus for like, God, the last couple of years is you've got to get that down and get it ingrained in the drivers. And we're getting there. I think there's always some anomalies, but yeah. And so when you're reliable, people will use it. So.
Any other questions or comments for staff or the transit?
I have a question. Trying to figure out the best way to ask it. Approximately how much of the 0.2% are y'all using right now to operate and expand and do things you want to do?
Right. We do use our operating grant funds for operations, and we have this capital for our capital projects and, expansions or, supporting, the infrastructure as much as we can within the transit system. We use our sales and use tax funds for all of that. But for operations, we have been able to use our grant funding for that.
Would it be safe to say just whatever the fund balance went up this last year is the difference between what you took in and what you used?
Yeah,
Okay.
probably. Yeah.
That's the difference. It's whatever the delta is for the fund balance.
Yeah, and the grant funding is what's helping to drive up the fund balance.
Right. But as we expand, it's expensive. Each route is very expensive. So we've got to take that into consideration too. We have been really fortunate for the amount of grant funding that we've had for operations.
one small comment. One, I want to thank you for the marketing the Eagles team do, whatever you do with Hope Source. It's great. I see it on campus. I've seen it around a couple of events. I'd say keep that up, especially the big events like the rodeo. There's no reason why we need to have everybody park around the rodeo when we have a great bus system around. So keeping up that marketing so that folks are aware that that's an option for them, so they're not having to deal with parking.
I just had a couple, but go ahead if you.
Well, so you mentioned the costs. So I see 32,500 O&M for each additional route.
Yeah,
There-
that's
30
what it would be, roughly, we're looking at.
Sure,
Taking it and
right.
dividing it by, we don't know how many miles that is going to be, but roughly that. And we charge Source, we pay them, I should say, I'm sorry, we pay them, per route, per service mile, per, so all that has to be taken into consideration.
So adding to go from hourly to half hour, is that the same?
Yeah, it would be
That's
about, it
a
would be the
route?
same. Yeah, it's really keeping the same routes. And Jim, you can even talk to that because he's done the study for us, which is just awesome because he loves transit.
Yeah, my first job out of college is writing a transit study with another person. So right now we have two routes that overlap, probably about 60% of it is overlap. And then each end split. And so you've got like the north end on the 13 and 14 routes are only hourly. And then in the south end, you've got some places that are only hourly, which for a town this small just is kind of unreasonable, delay. I mean, you could walk across town in an hour. So,
We're not all
or you ride
ambulatory.
your bike yeah, so, and part of it, yeah, we're like, I've been, talking about 30-minute frequency since I think the first day I was in there. And everybody's listening to me, I think, finally, because it's just critical. You know, you got more frequency, people use it more. There's places I'll go in town, I don't take the bus because I know it has the hourly route, and there's other places I'll take the bus, even though it's a long walk to the bus stop. If I had one next to me, like I said, I wouldn't even have a car if I had one up in my neighborhood, so.
Well, I think Route 15 and 16 would be a perfect example. You know, one goes this way, then it goes back. So if it's just going in one circle, then you're gonna, those passengers will get a 30-minute service. So that kind of gives you an idea. Same route, just one bus doing that.
Okay, we're like getting really close, and so we're gonna have to do a little bit of furniture. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah,
David
I
had-
could just make a
Go-
couple, I'll
go
keep
quick.
it short. Time, put the clock on me, 45 seconds. So thanks everyone for all the comments. And as Jim said and others, we've sort of been at PTAC over the last year and a half, we've been talking a lot about knowing that the 2/10 is going to be coming up for renewal. But we've been, as stated, we focused a lot on the facility improvements, and Betsy's done a great job. I think this budgetary situation that really appeared late in the year was something that we haven't had any conversation about at PTAC because it's really not in our wheelhouse. I think as others have mentioned, we've been very fortunate and we've been successful on all fronts. We've been successful getting voter support. We've been successful getting WashDOT grant money, both of which are not certain in the future. The risk is that we could lose one or both of those, and we would really struggle to maintain transit. We also have to recognize that Councilmember Palmer mentioned the county, not really, our service is really predominantly limited to our city service area. One of our partners is CWU and students. So conversations about the contribution that CWU makes going forward should be part of the discussion as well. But I think there is legitimate concern about asking the voters to approve a less, we'll just call it a murkier ask for sales tax. Transit is clear, transit and streets are kind of clear, but it depends on how you present and discuss. I think the possibility is that I think there's no doubt there's more risk involved in dividing the money. I think we need to also have a better idea of how the priorities on slide 20 outlined earlier match with a $1 million a year budget. And I don't know that they do. So that's kind of a broader question. So I know there's a lot of concern.
We have to shut down and change over really